As right now we are talking Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela. And this morning to discuss it in some more detail is Ignacio Ruben Smith. I don't know why I said it like that, but good morning to you, Mr.
Thank you very much for having me, and good morning to your viewers and to you.
Yeah, that's kind of the Spanish when you have it thinking in your head. He is actually of SM Solar Wind Energy Systems, and he is here to tell us some more about what's happening in Venezuela. And I want to start up talking about the SESTA tickets, but I also want you to tell us a little bit of what SM Solar Wind Energy Systems does.
Well, we develop financial platforms to bridge the gap for the greater part of the population in renewable energy.
Okay.
So that entails developing all these mechanisms to allow the greater part of the population access energy, electricity.
And I think, you know, solar wind energy is a way that everybody basically needs to, especially when you live in this part of the world, you know, to go that way and tap into that source as well.
Yes, it is. In fact, solar energy is the cheapest form of electricity generation nowadays. It's cheaper than coal and it's cheaper than fossil fuels
Okay.
without subsidies.
Without subsidies, and that's a good.
Yeah, the last power purchase agreement that was signed for a solar farm in the United Arab Emirates was signed at 2 cents a kilowatt hour, which is essentially what TNTech has arranged with all the power generators as a wholesale price.
Okay. All right, great. Now, want to get into talks with Venezuela. You are actually a Venezuelan. You're
That's
living
correct,
in Trinidad and Tobago, and you have been for the last 13 years or so.
That's correct.
But of course, still have your ties, your back and forth into Venezuela and Trinidad. Now, Maduro announced a 60% increase in the minimum wage and SESTA tickets to be replaced with the equivalent in bolivars. And the SESTA tickets are like vouchers that can only be used in groceries for certain items. Can you give us some more details on what this means and what the SESTA tickets are?
Well, the SESTA ticket is, is a part of the social program that the government is trying to push forward. SESTA tickets have been in existence for the last, I would say, 25 years. And what it does is that it gives you it doesn't have an impact on your severance or your antiquity or any other form of contribution that your employer will have towards when you leave the company and you have to be paid off. See, our labor laws are very strict. For every month that you work, you get 5 days severance and 5 days antiquity. And then after 3 months, once you've passed your probation period, then you're entitled to, depending on the company policy, you would be entitled to what it is known as profit sharing. Now, the whole object of the SESTA ticket is not to impact your antiquity, your severance, or your profit sharing. So it's a welcome move by a lot of the employers because it doesn't increase the amount of money that you have to set aside whenever you have to lay off people or someone leaves the company.
Okay, now it says that they're like vouchers that can only be used in groceries for certain items.
No, you can actually use them for most items.
Okay.
SESTA ticket could be, it's like a check.
Okay.
It has a nominal value, and you can go to the grocery. In fact, sometimes, depending on how the program is structured, you can actually use them to buy fast food.
Okay, so it's like a food voucher in a sense that
Yes.
can be used to purchase any type of food.
But it's not a food stamp.
Right.
Because food stamp has a different connotation. Food stamps is when you are trying to increase the level of income to those that are financially challenged. In the case of a SESTA ticket, it's given to everyone who's employed.
Okay, so is that what's being used now in Venezuela? How are people getting food as it is now in Venezuela? As I understand, there is a sort of a voucher system that you go and you present this to get your quota of food?
No, you go with your ID card, and there are specific days in which you can buy the items.
Okay.
Based on the last number of your ID card. Now, the issue is that if you are on minimum wage, then you have to pursue this option because you can get other food items around, but you'll have to pay like 3 times the price.
Okay.
And if you are on minimum wage, it becomes extremely hard to actually make your food basket. So the government has implemented a lot of these social programs to try to alleviate the hunger and to bridge that gap and reduce the level of extreme poverty in the country.
So how does the CESA ticket tie into all of this then? How does it work with respect to that, knowing that that is the case and it's difficult to get food in Venezuela right now?
Well, you could use a CESA ticket to purchase food at the supermarket.
Is there food to be purchased at the supermarket?
Well, that is the million-dollar question. What I can tell you is that most people will line up because these when you line up is to buy the food at a subsidized price.
Okay.
Not at the what we call the bachaquero price,
Okay.
which is like 3 times the amount. I don't know if you've been able to get a glance of the consumer price index in Venezuela for food, but as a World Bank figure, because this is something that I track regularly, it's 213%, and our inflation rate is 700 and something %. So whatever you could try and throw as much increases in salary, and you can try and use as many social programs that you can, but the fact of the matter is that because inflation is so rampant, there is no way that the salary would ever be able to buy in real terms food items.
How did Venezuela get to this state?
Well, it all began in 1978. From that point on, well, the government realized that by devaluating the currency, they could achieve a reduction, or basically not pay as much US dollars for the local debt that they had acquired. And then from that point on, what has happened is that we have not had fiscal discipline. So our monetary policy has not gone hand in hand with our fiscal policy, and that has degenerated into unsustainable situations. The first was when we had Cadivi, that was between the years of 1983 till 1988, where we had an exchange control system, and that exchange control system was had different rates for different items. If you had to purchase food, then it would have a different rate than medicines, and then we had an open market, which at the time I think it closed somewhere around 39 bolívares per US dollar in 1988. Then from there we had the government of President Perez, who was able to secure from the IMF approximately $5.5 billion to bail out the country. Well, not from the IMF, from the World Bank, because we have special drawing rights from the IMF. And then that we had to apply some really draconian measures. One of those measures was call it an increase in the price of fuel, which created a difficult situation. And between the months of end of February to somewhat in May, we had what it is known as El Caracazo, where close to 5,000 people died. Then after the ousting of President Perez, we had President Caldera, who came back and instituted an exchange control in the form of an agency called OTAC. And then from there on, we've had then President Chavez came into office. For the first couple of years, we had a free exchange, and then there was an exchange control was institutionalized, and we haven't moved away from that exchange control ever since.
Why was that implemented, the exchange control? How did that come about?
Exchange controls in Venezuela are usually tied to low crude prices.
Okay.
So every time we had an issue with gain in foreign exchange or receiving foreign exchange from the sale of crude, the government found themselves in a bind, and therefore they had to restrict purchases overseas.
Okay. Now, the last time you've been to Venezuela is actually in December, you said?
Yes.
Right. What have you seen, or what did you see when you were in there in Venezuela, and what is different now as we are in the 1st of May, heading into a new month?
Well, there was a situation that you could have seen was brewing in the faces of my compatriots. You could have seen the level of despair and the level of desperation in the faces of the population. In fact, when the morning that I was coming back to Trinidad, I saw a couple of lines in a supermarket that is close to where my parents live, and there was several lines, and I asked, which ones are those lines? So my dad said, the short one is for people who are handicapped and the elderly. And then you have, no, for the handicapped is one line, for the elderly is another line, and for the normal population is a different line.
Okay.
I didn't get to see the one for the normal population, but my understanding from talking to some of my friends and people that I know is that you can stand in that line for at least 2 days before you can actually enter a supermarket.
Now, there are also reports of rioting taking place in Venezuela. Some people are saying that it's being exaggerated, that it's not really to that extent. Can you speak to that?
Well, I can tell you from my experience, because I lived through El Caracazo in February of 1989, and I also lived the last social unrest that we had in the early part of the 2001, 2002, and 2003. And these episodes essentially where the general population has lost any form of fear. And that usually happens when you have pushed to an extreme where you no longer value your life as such, and you're prepared to do anything just to survive. And that is extremely explosive because, again, I'm sure you've seen some of the images on social media where people are just clashing with the National Guards and with the National Police. And I don't see a way out. It's not going to be an easy way out. I do believe that unless the government agrees to some form of, not even dialogue, but some form of celebrating an election and move towards a change in the hands that are currently administrating the country, the violence is going to escalate.
Now, many people have alluded on social media that Trinidad is headed down that path. You've lived through it from the past till now. You've lived through that. Can you see us on that path?
Do you want an honest opinion?
I do.
Yes. The variables, your macroeconomic variables of Trinidad and Tobago are very similar. The behavior is very similar to that of Venezuela. If you take an average of GDP over the last 15 or 20 years, you would see that Trinidad and Tobago has had dismal growth. We have had upsurge in GDP, but the reality is that if you take a mean of all those years, we have not grown as a country. Then you have another component which is very volatile, and a lot of people are not looking at it, and it is that the gap, which is measured with something known as the Gini index or the Gini coefficient, is becoming wider and wider, meaning that we are approaching one which is complete inequality. So you're now, we now face a situation where the last time that I checked the figures was 1992, that was the last time, and Gini index for Trinidad and Tobago was 45. I believe that now, if we do estimate the Gini index for Trinidad and Tobago, it will be closer to about 0.5, 0.56, 0.57, which represent a very large inequality among the social groups in the country.
That actually looks a little bit dismal this morning, to tell you the truth, Mr. Smith. I'm glad that you were honest with me, though, because it has been circulating on social media, seeing what's happening with Venezuela so close to us. We've got family, friends, close connections. Same thing with reliance on oil and gas and that type of thing, the situation that we are in right now. I can only hope that Trinidad and Tobago can possibly pull themselves out before they actually get to that point.
Well, we need leaders that have to be extremely creative to bring about change that is definitely needed. And we just have to move away from the old recycling of ideas that may have worked 30 years ago but no longer work nowadays.
Yeah. Thank you very much,
My
Ignacio.
pleasure.
Ruben Smith, SM Solar Wind Energy Systems, Venezuela national, living in Trinidad and Tobago, and we're glad to have him here and, sharing knowledge with us. Having, giving us a very good history of Venezuela, what happened over the years, and hopefully it will not reflect what will happen to Trinidad and Tobago over the next few years as well. Thank you so much and all the best.